Joining us right now is Associate Professor of the Middlebury Institute's Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies, Dr. Philipp Bleek. He served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs at the Pentagon. Dr. Bleek, your thoughts on this. What is the chance of Russia using chemical weapons? What kind of weapons are we talking about that would be available? Can the U.S. do anything to stop it?
Sure. So I actually think Russia won't end up using chemical weapons, but if they do, I won't be surprised. It would be yet another escalation that I think, from Putin's perspective, would be a mistake. But I think the Ukraine invasion and other steps that he's taken have themselves been mistakes. So if it happens, I won't be surprised. It will be horrific. It would put Russia in a tiny club of states that have used chemical weapons indiscriminately in the last decades, including Syria's Assad regime in the context of the Civil War and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. I hope they don't. I think the United States and its allies have options to punish Russia and to try to deter them, but they're not a great set of options. I'm happy to unpack those a little further if you'd like.
I mean, we saw under the Trump administration, when Syria used chemical weapons on its people, the U.S. sent strikes into Syria. As a result, what would the U.S. do? What would it be like on the ground in Ukraine, the impact of these chemical weapons deployed?
Sure. Yeah, so I staffed that issue in the Pentagon, although obviously I'm here speaking in a personal capacity. If Russia crossed this red line, to use a phrase from the Obama administration and the Syria case, there would almost certainly be consequences. I don't think they would involve boots on the ground in military action, although there would be calls for that. And the reason I say that is I think we are all cognizant both of the dangers of a wider war and in particular the dangers of a nuclear war, which the UN Secretary General most recently warned about and others are very aware of. And I don't think that's a high risk, but that's always a risk in the background that policymakers are thinking about. So what would we do? And what is Putin thinking right now that we might do that might shape his calculus? I think one thing that would be on the table if Russia escalated to chemical weapons is a designation of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. That is the most draconian version of the economic tool set that we have. It would impose an extraordinarily draconian set of sanctions on Russia, even more than has already been imposed. And there are downsides to imposing that, but I think that would seriously be on the table if Russia violated this red line. So that is one that I think is quite plausible. And then there are a variety of other ways in which we respond. But I think actually the most significant consequence for Russia here would be self-imposed. Russia would be an extraordinary pariah state in the aftermath of using chemical weapons here. It would join a very small number of states who've behaved in this way in recent decades. And I hope that President Putin in Russia is cognizant of that downside as he weighs this decision.
Well, I mean, it was really striking. You mentioned the UN Secretary General comments. It was a dire warning as the war in Ukraine enters day 21. Here it is.
The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility. It's time to stop the horror unleashed on the people of Ukraine and get on the path of diplomacy and peace.
Dr. Bleek, here's Dagan McDowell. Go ahead, Dagan.
You just brought up the if biological weapons are used, that Russia potentially could be labeled a state sponsor of terror. We're negotiating with Iran and did negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran as that nation was labeled a state sponsor of terror. So we have proven as a nation that we will attempt to open the door for a nation that's a terrorist country.
Sure. Yeah. So in those cases, and in this case, it is in our interest to negotiate. It's not only in our interest to negotiate with our friends, it's particularly in our interest to negotiate with states with whom we have challenging relationships. And in fact, the only off-ramp in this Ukraine situation is a negotiated solution that all sides can agree on. We're not going to, Russia, although it is struggling in Ukraine, is not going to be militarily defeated. It is possible that they decide to pull back their forces, given how the conflict is going. But I think the most plausible end state here is, in fact, a negotiated solution, and we should hope for one. because the alternative to that, as the UN Secretary General noted, one of the alternatives to that, the most extreme alternative to that, is nuclear war. And I think that's something that we can all agree is in our interest to avoid, even as we have other things that we disagree about. So we absolutely should be negotiating with the Russians, and we should be trying to find a mutually acceptable bargain that incorporates both Ukrainian interests and things that the Russians can agree to.
Well, we will see if that deal actually finalizes. The Russians have been negotiating on behalf of the United States to get back into that deal, even as the U.S. Calls out Russian aggression on Ukraine. It's actually quite extraordinary. Dr. Philipp Bleek, thanks very much for being here this morning.